In this recording, we'll discuss the spinal cord. Your spinal cord runs approximately 18 inches from your foramen magnum in the skull all the way down to approximately L1 or L2 in your lumbar vertebra. Okay, so your spinal cord does not extend all the way down like many people assume. It does have a tapered end around the L1, L2 region. We call this the conus medullaris. Okay. And from that conus medullaris, which is hard to say, you can see all these branches. These are your spinal nerves, some of your spinal nerves, or if you prefer the term cauda equina, which means horse's tail. Okay, so supposedly this looks somewhat like a horse's tail. Okay. And then the very end, okay, we find the filum terminale, okay, which is really a thin strand of fibrous tissue that continues all the way down to approximately the second sacral vertebra. So we've got some spinal nerves running down here as well. Okay, but remember, technically, the spinal cord itself stopped right up in this region. Okay, but we still have to innervate all of this down below. Okay, all right. So your spinal cord is wrapped in the same three meninges that your brain was. So just to refresh, the outermost layer was the dura mater. Okay, between the dura mater and the walls of the vertebral canal, we find the epidural space. Okay, we've got some adipose tissue there. We've got some blood vessels. Okay, most people are familiar with epidurals during childbirth. Okay, so kind of goes hand in hand there. The next layer, we're going superficial to deep. The middle layer would be the arachnoid layer. The arachnoid mater, that spiderweb-like network. We've got collagen and elastic fibers within this layer. We've got that subarachnoid space still that has the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, and that CSF is still acting as a shock absorber, and it's used to transport nutrients, gases, neurotransmitters, waste products, all kinds of good stuff. And then the innermost layer is the pia mater. Okay, we've got more elastic and collagen fibers, which anchors the brain and the spinal cord to the underlying areas. Boop, here we go. All right, so looks just a tiny bit different in the spinal cord than it did the brain, just because of the whole setup here. But we've still got the same layers. So this little section, that is your spinal cord. That's it. That's all you get. It's a tiny little space. If you can think back to the vertebral foramen, when we looked at the bones, that wasn't a very big hole in that. So that's as big as your spinal cord gets. And let's see here. We've got the dura layer, dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater touches the spinal cord itself, just like in the brain. And here you can see the three layers as well: dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater, and then spinal cord itself. Okay? All right. Now, your spinal cord. We're going to have some nerves coming out of your spinal cord. We call these spinal nerves. I know, it's a pretty good name, spinal nerves. We've got 31 pairs of spinal nerves. They are named for the vertebra inferior to each of the nerves. So for example, the spinal nerve that emerges inferior to the T1 vertebra is known as the spinal nerve T1. Okay, so we're coming out right below the actual vertebral bone itself. Okay, but in the neck, it's never easy, right, you guys? In the neck region, each spinal nerve takes the name of the cervical vertebra immediately beneath it. Okay. So in the cervical region, it's just a tiny bit different, okay, which is how we get all these weird numbers. So we end up with 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal nerve. Okay, so that's our 31 pairs. Now, all 31 pairs of spinal nerves, these are considered to be mixed nerves because they carry both sensory and motor innervations. All right, so we carry sensory and motor neurons, sensory and motor information, all of that Both of those run through spinal nerves, okay? Mixed nerves. We have some terminology that we must familiarize ourselves with. The dorsal root, okay? The dorsal root ganglion and the ventral roots. So let's find us a picture. Where's me a picture? Here's me a picture. Okay, all right, so this is your spinal cord, okay? These ends, okay, this is what we're talking about. So the spinal nerve itself is the very end where these things fuse. Okay, so this is the spinal nerve section. Okay, this is the spinal nerve. So mixed peripheral nerve, same thing, mixed spinal nerve. And you'll see that we split, we branch. Okay, this is what we were talking about. And we will go back and cover that in a little bit more detail, but I wanted to show you a picture. So dorsal root, okay, so you know dorsal means posterior. So as the sensory signals come in, we're going to go back through the dorsal root. Okay, we'll integrate in the central nervous system, and the motor information will come through the ventral root, okay, the front part. And then we have one more term, dorsal root ganglion. Okay, we see this fat little section on both sides that kind of pokes out. That is the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, so again, just to get our terminology down real quick, we're looking at our picture. So the portion that runs along the back side is the dorsal root. The extra fat part is the dorsal root ganglion. And then the front part that wraps around would be the ventral root. Okay. Sometimes it's a little easy to kind of get lost. If you just see a random picture, like, oh, what's the front and what's the back? Because if you're just looking at this area of the actual spinal cord, it's like, oh, there's really nothing super distinctive about that. It's got one of these fissures, but oh, here's another one. So what are we looking for? I would suggest, just to make sure you're always oriented in the correct manner, look for these dorsal root ganglion. These little fat parts, okay, you only find them on the dorsal aspect, the back side, okay? So if these guys are in the back, okay, then you are looking at this face on. All right, this would be the front, and this would be the back, okay? All right, so now that we kind of have an idea of what this looks like, let's go back real quick. Maybe, here we go, and make sure we understand what's happening in these three locations. So your dorsal root, this is where you have the afferent axons of sensory receptors, okay? So sensory neurons are bringing information from the body, and we're taking them into the spinal cord itself. Specifically in the dorsal root ganglion, this is where you have cell bodies of sensory neurons, okay, which are continuing to help bring information into the spinal cord, okay? Now the ventral root is completely different. So dorsal root anything. Dorsal is for sensory information. Your ventral root is efferent axons of your motor neurons. You're taking information from your spinal cord and you're sending it out to your body. And this includes both somatic and visceral motor information, so both voluntary and involuntary. Okay, and just to make sure it's really sticking in your big old brain, don't forget somatic nervous system. That is your skeletal muscle, that's voluntary movements. And then your autonomic nervous system, and that visceral motor division stimulates glands, smooth muscles, cardiac tissue, all that good stuff. That is involuntary. Okay. All right, so we kind of know what it looks like. And again, over here, your sensory information is coming in through the spinal nerve. We're going to go through the dorsal root and get the dorsal root ganglion. We'll keep on going. Dorsal root. We're going to send that information into the spinal cord. It will very likely go up to your brain for processing. And then your brain comes up with a plan, and we send the motor information down out your spinal cord through the ventral root. These are motor neurons. And you will see we'll continue through the spinal nerve itself, and we'll go innervate a muscle and have some sort of motor response that way. But this is how it always happens. I can't emphasize that enough. Sensory information goes along the dorsal part, and motor information comes out the ventral part. Okay. right, so just a little bit more on anatomy of the spinal cord. You do have both gray matter and white matter in the spinal cord. The gray matter of the spinal cord, this is where you find cell bodies, dendrites, and any unmyelinated axons that we have. There are three distinct regions of gray matter within the spinal cord. We have ventral horns, we have lateral horns, and we have dorsal horns. Now, if you prefer anterior and posterior horns, that's okay as well. Okay, you will see these terms in various places, and you know that these terms are interchangeable. Okay, I just kind of always grew up with dorsal and ventral when I was in school, so that's what I tend to use. But again, anterior and posterior is fine as well. So, our anterior horns, our ventral horns, these are cell bodies of the somatic nervous system. Okay, we have learned repeatedly, and I know it's in your big old brain by now, somatic is your voluntary skeletal muscles. Okay, you just learned that those axons are going to exit the spinal cord via your ventral roots. Your lateral horns, these are cell bodies of your autonomic nervous system. Okay, specifically the sympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system. Because this is still motor functions, we will be leaving the spinal cord via the ventral roots. Okay? And don't forget that your autonomic nervous system is controlling involuntary functions of your cardiac, smooth muscles, and glands as well. And then we have your posterior or your dorsal horn. This is interneurons. Okay, now you have learned previously that interneurons are only found within the central nervous system. Okay, so don't forget that your spinal cord is part of your central nervous system. Okay, so that's why we can find interneurons here. These are going to be relay neurons. You're basically taking somatic and visceral sensory information and relaying it between the body and the central nervous system. Okay. And then we have this little connecting line. Okay, we've got this gray commissure. This helps take nerves across horizontally. So do you remember the idea of being contralateral and decussation? Okay, so the left brain controls the right body, vice versa. That contralateral control. This is where we would actually decussate. It would be at the gray commissure. And I didn't point that out earlier, so let's go back to our picture. So in the very, very center, you've got a central canal. That's fine. But do you see that the one side and the other side are connected? This little bar that connects these two sides, that is your gray commissure. And in the very center would be the central canal. So you've got that dorsal horn, okay, that lateral horn on the side, and that ventral horn on the front. Oh, here's a better picture. All right, here we go. So you've got your gray commissure in the middle. You do have a posterior and an anterior region since the central canal kind of sticks right in the middle. And then here we go. Posterior horn, okay, lateral horn, anterior horn. Kind of looks like a butterfly. Okay, kind of looks like a butterfly. But here we go, showing you the dorsal horn is good for somatic and visceral sensory information. Okay. Lateral horn is visceral motor, and anterior horn is somatic motor. Okay. All of this motor, right? Remember, sensory is coming in to the spinal cord. Motor is going out of the spinal cord to the body. We're coming in from the dorsal root. We're going out of the ventral root. All right, we also have white matter. In the spinal cord, the white matter surrounds the gray matter, which, if you remember back to the brain, that would be the opposite. Okay, so in the brain, the gray matter was on the outside, the white matter was inside. Here it is reversed. White matter is on the outside. You also have these regions. Instead of calling them horns, if you like the term funiculi, you are welcome to use that term. I'm going to call them columns. Okay, so you've got white columns. We classify the tracks that run through these columns based on the direction that the signals are going. So we have ascending tracks and we have descending tracks. And hopefully hopefully that sounds familiar to you. You hopefully, again, already know that ascending tracts are going to take sensory information up to the brain through the spinal cord. Okay. Now, depending on what kind of information will depend on what kind of tract we're going to use. We have two options. Your spinothalamic tract takes pain and temperature information to the thalamus. So from the spinal cord to the thalamus. Hopefully you remember your thalamus is your relay station. Okay. This runs through the lateral white columns. Okay. If you have ever heard of phantom limb pain, it occurs in people that have had limbs amputated or removed. Sometimes people that have had a leg removed suddenly say, oh, my leg hurts, and it's a leg that's been removed. It's like, you don't have a leg anymore. So here's what's happening. You have activity in the sensory neurons or the interneurons in this region of the spinothalamic pathway, so it kind of almost tricks your brain into thinking that your leg hurts even though your leg's not there anymore. And then we have the spinocerebellar tracts. This takes joint and muscle sensory information to the cerebellum, so spinal cord, cerebellum. Remember, your cerebellum coordinates muscle movements. This also runs through your lateral white columns as well. So again, all that sensory information, you know, ascending tracts send sensory information up to your brain. Descending tracts are going to take motor information from the brain down the spinal cord, okay, and we'll send it out the spinal cord to the body, and it will depend on whether it's voluntary or involuntary information. That will depend on where exactly it will leave the spinal column. So here we go. We've got the posterior white column in the back, lateral white column on the side, anterior white column in the front. Okay. All right. Now, peripheral nerves. Okay. These are the main organs of the peripheral nervous system, okay, and they innervate the majority of the structures in your body. These come in three categories. We have mixed nerves, sensory nerves, and motor nerves. Okay, so mixed nerves we've already mentioned. These contain both sensory and motor neurons. Okay, this includes all 31 pairs of your spinal nerves that we described a little earlier. And then we also have cranial nerves. Okay, so cranial nerves are going to be located higher up around your cranium. That should make sense. And these are going to innervate structures in your head and neck region. You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And unlike spinal nerves, they're not all mixed nerves. Some of them are. Your trigeminal, your facial, your glossopharyngeal, and your vagus nerve. They are mixed nerves. But some of your cranial nerves only carry sensory information, so they're sensory nerves. This would be your olfactory, your optic, and your vestibulocochlear nerves. And then some of your cranial nerves only run motor information. Okay, and this would include your oculomotor, your trochlear, your abducens, your accessory, and your hypoglossal. Okay, so we've got three different types: mixed, sensory, and motor. The spinal nerves we mentioned are all mixed, but we have those three options for your cranial nerves.